Hello, welcome to this session of Path to Apron. My name is Ursula Jansen and I'm an archaeologist and culinary historian, and I am greeting you from Puglia in southern Italy. Now, we are going to prepare a medieval feast together, a feast with recipes from more or less the same time but from different regions. I will prepare 5 different dishes and from regions ranging from the Middle East to Scandinavia, and by preparing them I will demonstrate how the different traditions of the regions influenced each other. First, maybe some remarks on historical recipes in general. I mean, we have written down historical recipes for a long time. The oldest ones we know are from ancient Mesopotamia. Then we have ancient Roman recipes, and the closer we get to modern times, the number of recipes actually written down gets bigger. This means that for the medieval period we have quite a collection from different regions of the Middle East and Europe mainly. Now, what they have in common is that they are very short and very, well, they don't go into detail and they don't give any quantities at all. Because they had in mind a cook that already knew the dish, that just needed a reminder on the ingredients, basically. Now, what all these recipes today have in common, because this is a medieval feast, is that they are upper class recipes, with 1 or 2 exceptions, but these are things that would have also been eaten by the upper class. I will go further into detail with each single dish, but this is also one of the characteristics of the dishes that have been written down in cookbooks, because it is the cooks of the courts, of kings, of bishops, of counts, who have written down their recipes. So all we have basically is upper class recipe, which means also for today, all but one dish includes meat. Now let's start with the Middle East. Some of the Middle Eastern books have such poetic names as Reliefs of the Table, about the delights of food and different dishes, or The Substance of Life, or even The Art of Winning a Lover's Heart. And the title reflects the message. The presentation of a dish is as important as its ingredients. All senses are involved. Now the first dish is a very simple dish. We start easily. And it's called the black barida. Barida means, basically comes from Arabic barid, cold, and it's a cold starter. And a barida always consists of a cooked main dish. In this case, I have the pre-cooked chicken, which is simply boiled, nothing else, with a sauce on top. Now, this specific recipe, the black barida, comes from the book of dishes from Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq from Baghdad in the 10th century. And it basically says to make a sauce of black raisins with vinegar. Now, what I have, crushed black raisins, what I do have here is concentrated grape juice, something that here in Puglia goes as vin cotto. It's rather sweet, but concentrated juice. And then we add some vinegar. Now, vinegar actually is another interesting thing. You have, of course, vinegar, but throughout the medieval period, very popular was another form of acidifier, which is this thing here. It is verjuice, and it's the juice of unripe grapes. We will use this one later. Now we mix, in this case vinegar. Baridas usually have acidic sauces. Sweet and sour, as we will see also later, is a very, very popular taste combination both in the Middle East and in Europe. Now we also add some olive oil. Cinnamon. And a little bit of ginger. And pour this black sauce over the chicken. And that is essentially already the starter for our feast. Now with the next dish, we're moving to Egypt. And this is a dish that is called Romania. It's from the cookbook Cans from the 14th century. And it essentially is tiny meatballs in a pomegranate sauce with pistachios. And this Romania is a dish that also appears in European cookbooks of that time. So this is there we start to already move to have a dish that exists in several regions, but that is clearly inspired by a Middle Eastern dish. Now, we are using now the recipe from Egypt, the original one that is from the Liber de Coquina, which comes from France or Italy, also in the 14th century, uses chicken instead of meatballs, and it uses almonds instead of pistachios. But essentially it's the same, and it even has the same name. Now the recipe starts with prepare a concentrated meat broth. So this I already did in advance. They would have used probably rather cheap. I have beef here. This is a beef broth, and I have minced meat. Now, the point is to make tiny meatballs. It says the size of hazelnuts. They actually should be even a little smaller, but I think that's fine. And put them into the prepared broth. Now, that being done, here, lots of meatballs, we add some sweet rose water, and the pomegranate juice. Pomegranate juice is quite sour, so again here we have the sweet and sour element. And we also add some saffron. Like that. And now we bring the whole thing to the boil. Meanwhile, I prepare the remaining ingredients, which is fresh mint, chopped and crushed pistachios. Voila. And some pistachios. Mint. Now that the meatballs have boiled, we add the mint and the crushed pistachios. And this is ready to serve. First, some general comments maybe about the medieval cuisine of Europe. Now, you will see that the combination of different tastes is very important, and it's impossible often to distinguish sweet and savory dishes from each other. There was no distinction between a main course and a dessert. Everything was laid out at the table at the same time, and people would eat from what they just felt like eating. So they would mix sweet dishes and savory dishes, and many of the dishes that were actually both. Now, it was not only important to import the different kinds of tastes, because, well, it tastes good, but also it is important to maintain your health, because different tastes represent different humors, qualities that regulate human bodies, which was blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And each of these qualities, humors, was also associated with different kinds of food. So, a good food, a tasty food, at the same time is also a healthy food. Now, the portions during those 2 or maximum 3 meals a day must have been huge, because the calorie intake was much bigger than what we need today. Work was hard. In winter, houses were scarcely heated, and depending on who you were in society, your food would have mainly been dependent on cereals and vegetables. And in order to get a calorie intake of 3,000 to 4,000 calories, which is the estimated intake for an average farmer, and to do that with vegetable soup and bread, you need to eat huge amounts. The next dish I would like to present is a dish that, in variations, is still very popular here in Puglia and actually also in other parts of southern Europe. It's a fava bean puree. Now, fava beans are some of the only beans that actually have been known in the medieval times, because all the other kinds of beans that we know now, kidney beans, white beans, even green beans, they actually come from the Americas. Now, I have soaked these dried fava beans overnight. This dish is also said to have been one of the favorite dishes of Frederick II, Emperor of Hohenstaufen, Roman Emperor. And but this version is more the medieval version that we are going to do now, because this one is with caramelized onions. And again, I have 2 different written versions of it, because we are slowly moving further north. Now, one is Italian, that simply talks of fried onions, and we have from different source, German source from the city of Würzburg, das Buch von Guter Speis, and this one also calls for onions, but there they add also saffron, caraway, and pepper, and also vinegar, or in this case I'm going to use verjuice. But first I'm going to put those fava beans to the boil. Let's prepare the onion topping for the fava bean puree. And these are now red onions, local onions from here, Cipolla di Tropea, but you can also use different onions, although I find that red onions, which are a little more sweetish, are the best to do so. Okay, we fried those onions in olive oil. As I mentioned before, there are several versions of that dish. Now, the version that Frederick II Holy Roman Emperor, love is said to have included a little bit of honey to make sure it really gets nicely caramelized. Of course, you can also caramelize onions without honey, just by the sweetness in themselves, but I like to add a little bit of honey, and of course that's totally in the spirit of medieval cuisine. And we add a little bit of bird juice. The German version of the time adds actually vinegar and even a little bit of beer, but I don't find that goes with honey. It just gives you an idea of the different possibilities. We can add a little bit of caraway. And importantly, at the end of the cooking process, we are also going to add some saffron, because this is the fancy version of the dish. Of course, now this dish, basically the puree the fava bean puree, in itself is a dish that is not upper class, that would have been eaten by everybody, and is still very, very popular here in southern Italy. What makes it a fancy dish is the addition of things like, well, honey in some part, but most of all, of course, saffron, which is still, unfortunately, very expensive. And it turns nice and yellow right away. The fava beans have cooked now for 1 hour in slightly salted water, and with a wooden spoon we crush them. And of course you can also use a household mixer for that, but of course the original way would be to use a wooden spoon. Now we also add some olive oil. You can make this a little firmer or a little more liquid. I personally prefer the more liquid version. To serve, pour the puree into a bowl and top with the caramelized saffron. Our next dish is the medieval show dish par excellence, blanc manger, the white food. It's a very fancy food because it combines foods that were rare, exotic, and expensive. And the white color of all the ingredients symbolizes that, because anything white was expensive, basically. We have here chicken breast, just cooked, not fried, so it stays as white as possible. Then we have here rice flour. This is something very fancy at the time because rice was imported from far away, hence exotic and expensive. We have white lard. We have almond milk. Almond milk is actually used in a lot of medieval recipes, especially during Lent as a substitute for milk, but also in many other dishes outside of Lent in combination with meat. And then we have something very, very fancy for that time, and that is white sugar. That was something that only the rich could afford. again, we have from this dish a lot of different recipes because this was common all over Europe. And you can actually see from, now again, Middle Eastern recipes that there are some predecessors. So the idea of combining chicken and almond milk and sugar might actually have come from the Middle East, but it got immensely popular as a show dish, a fancy dish. Now again, here there are also several versions. So today I will focus on one that is actually described in two different sources. One is again the same as I was already talking about with the fava bean puree from Würzburg, from Germany, das Buch von guter Speis, and also in the form of curry, which is from England around 1390. Those two recipes are basically the same. Then there are other variations. For example, in my just published cookbook, Garum, I use a different one that does not use rice flour, but rice. So it's a little more, well, less fine, a little more how we would maybe expect a chicken risotto. We need to cut and chop finely that chicken breast. And the combination of chicken and sugar might seem strange to us, a sweet chicken dish. In fact, it still exists in Turkey, a dessert based on chicken breast. Not far from this one here at all. It was a geographically very widespread tradition. Now, these pieces, fine, of chicken are put into a cookpot. Add lard. Again, we don't know how much, but probably they would have put quite a good amount. Let's do it like that. And we need some salt. Sugar. And now I add the almond milk. And I start boiling the whole thing a little more. Once this mixture boils, we carefully add some of the rice flour. To thicken it to a paste, to a thick paste. It should become completely firm after cooling down. Yes, that's the idea. Put the resulting paste into a form, something that you can turn upside down, a cake form, something like that, because it's supposed to be served like in the shape of a pudding. And now we just spread it evenly and then we leave it to cool down before serving it. There are, by the way, some colored varieties as well. And one of them is yellow, then you add saffron and a couple of egg yolks. Oh, one of them is green and you add chopped herbs. Okay, let's see how this one is doing it. Yeah, perfect. With the last dish, let's move to Scandinavia. Scandinavia is a little apart insofar that we do not have any written records about what were people actually eating, and for that we have to rely on the archaeological record. Now, we know which ingredients they ate, and so I'm kind of making this dish up with some of the possible ingredients. And we knew they ate a lot of cereals, barley, oats, also some wheat, and probably a lot of that in the form of gruel. Bread also existed, of course. Then we have as fruits, the fruits that were available: apples, berries, not much actually. And as nuts, we have hazelnuts. A lot of hazelnut shells were found. Meat, we have many sheep and goats, but also pork. And you might think fish every day, but no, not fish every day, because Scandinavia is not only coast, people live inlands, and transporting fish has always been a problem. So right at the coast, yes, probably, people ate a lot of fish, but a little further inland, you had dried fish, but salt was actually imported, which is why it wasn't as cheap as you might imagine. And of course, wild herbs of all kinds. So knowing all this, I have come up with something that represents, let's say, a not too simple meal that might have been a simple gruel with some berries and nuts, but a meat dish, because we are still having a feast. So what I have here is pork, but not any pork. It's actually a domesticated boar, which is closest to the old pig races that people had. But what you usually get as modern pig, that it's not really what pig would have tasted before. But it had much more fat. I have gathered a little bit of wild herbs. I mean, it's June in southern Italy, so the wild herb season is basically over. I found I have some wild chard. I have a little bit of wild rocket and wild mustard leaves. I have purslane, and I have some sorrel. I gathered this an hour ago, and it's hot here. Then I have dried apples, because of course you could dry and store any food for the whole of the year. I have barley, I have salt, and I have lard again, which would have been a very common fat. And we'll simply make a stew out of that. This still has the skin on it, that is hard. We put that aside. Frying the meat and a little bit of lard, then adding barley and some of the other ingredients. First put the lard and making this a stew. You could say a Viking barley risotto. And here we have much less influence from the southern traditions. But of course there was trade. We brown the pork cubes. It takes a little while. We add barley. I use pearl barley that cooks quicker and is done in half an hour. Some salt. And water. It's a stew after all. Now we can already add the dried apples as well. And chop the herbs to be added later. Now we just leave this to boil for half an hour until the barley and the meat is done. Now, half an hour later, this is done, yes, we add those herbs. I mean, you can just use whatever herbs you have at hand. Parsley doesn't hurt, or well, sorrel would be a classic. But yeah, feel free to improvise. And that's the last of those dishes. Oh, Viking stew. A white linen cloth was considered absolutely indispensable. And people would eat very neatly and civilized with their fingers, which was not a sign of indulgence or being somewhat primitive. At the contrary, when the first forks came up, they were frowned upon. People would wonder why these fuzzy eaters wouldn't dare to touch their food.